What are some horrifying history facts or events that most people don't know about? The Suffragists' Night of Terror, November 15, 1917, where 33 women fighting for the right to vote were picked up from in front of the White House and put in prison. They suffered beatings, being forced to stand, hang all night with their hands tied above their heads, being thrown around and smashed into iron furniture, and humiliation at the hands of guards. One woman was knocked out after having her head bounced off an iron bench, and her cellmate became so distraught under the impression the unconscious woman was dead that she suffered a heart attack. She was denied medical care until the next morning. These women were picked up off the street and thrown in jails where they were abused with no access to counsel, all because they dared ask Woodrow Wilson to allow them to vote. Edit: my comment shouldn't have more upvotes than the thread. Be sure to upvote the op. They're the one who inspired this comment. The more I hear about Woodrow Wilson, the more I think he's a cunt. He was a truly terrible president. The Franklin expedition in 1845 to find the Northern Passage, which would be a faster route when traveling and freighting cargo across the Northern Hemisphere to Asia and China. The ships got caught in the ice and therefore stuck there forever. The crew turned to cannibalism as a way to survive in the cold and stayed on the lower decks of the ships, where they'd eventually get very sick because of malnourishment. One of the ships were named Terra, ironically. There's a book about it which of course puts in some supernatural elements to the story. I however think the real story is creepy in its own right. Imagine being stuck in the ice, it's cold as fuck everywhere, there's no food left and the nights are very dark. AMC is making it a series as well, named after the ship, the Terror. It's directed by Ridley Scott, so it's bound to be unnerving. At one point, Christopher Columbus fed a live child sex slave to dogs, and they still let him direct Harry Potter. Wow. But have you seen Home Alone? We can't overlook his evil for that dope movie. Rwandan genocide. It lasted for months. For fucking months, and 1 million people died. Most died from being hacked to death by machetes. Edit spelling. Hey, remember that time an organization funded by the US government deliberately withheld syphilis treatments from black men for 40 years in an attempt to see how the disease would progress, despite the fact that a cure was readily available? Oh, and how it continued until 1972. Do you listen to stuff you missed in history class? They did a fantastic episode on this. The government also told a group of black men they had syphilis so they could use them as a control group. When one of their controls actually caught syphilis, they would just switch them to the unmedicated group. Engineers advised NASA to postpone the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger due to concerns about the O-rings in the solid rocket boosters at low temperatures. They were overruled, largely because the next launch window wasn't on a school day, and having students watch the first teacher launch to space was big PR goal. As everyone knows, that launch failed because an O-ring in one of the SRBs failed. McAuliffe's launch wasn't the only problem. There was a general culture of we won't figure out solutions to problems until they actually happen there. The O-ring concern had been noted many years before that launch. The Great Siege of Malta. Mustafa had the bodies of the knights decapitated and their bodies floated across the bay on mock crucifixes. In response, de Valette beheaded all his Turkish prisoners, loaded their heads into his cannons, and fired them into the Turkish camp. During Stalin's forced industrialization of Russia, he would take all the farmers' food, crops they grew, leaving them to starve. This led to extensive cannibalism, including many recorded cases of parents eating their children. Holodomor, yeah, Russia still doesn't acknowledge it as genocidal actions. King Leopold II of Belgium 1902, responsible for millions of deaths in the Belgian Congo, and had little black boys' hands cut off for not producing enough rubber. For anyone wondering if this history is being whitewashed in Belgium, it's not. We are taught this stuff in history class without censure. Pretty much all Belgians are aware of this historical fact. Should also add that this stuff happened when Congo was still Leopold's private property. After this stuff came to light, he had to give up Congo to the Belgian government. The vast majority of France's 80,000 inmates at the infamous Devil's Island prison camps never made it back to France. Many inmates, even after serving their sentence, were forced to stay in French Guiana to pay for their prison stay. Devil's Island was a single island used almost entirely for escape artists who'd broken out of the other prisons, and conditions there weren't bad. You are taking about French Guiana in general, dozens of prison hellholes. That in 1961, the US almost accidentally nuked Goldsboro, North Carolina. A B-52 carrying 3-ish megaton bombs took off out of the Air Force Base there, but the plane was leaking fuel. The pilot ordered everybody to eject and the plane broke apart before impact. The bombs required for separate arming switches to be activated to actually detonated, so the pilot was more worried about his crew. 5 made it, but sadly 3 still died either in the crash or in the ejection. The bombs both hit the ground with only very minor damage and obviously did not detonate. However, upon recovery somehow one bomb had 3 of its 4 arming mechanisms activated. One simple, low-voltage switch was all that kept a bomb roughly 250 times stronger than the one dropped on Hiroshima from going off in North Carolina. Edit. Spelling. Edit 2. More spelling. Removing inadvertent slander of Decepticon leadership. The Native American boarding school movement, popularized by the slogan "Kill the Indian, Save the Man," meant that thousands of Native children were rounded up, taken to boarding schools, had their hair and clothes changed, and were forced to speak only in English. Many people don't know that these kidnappings continued through the 1940s. My grandmother and her sisters were picked up on the school wagon in 1939 when they were playing outside, while their mom was gone. For weeks, she didn't know what happened to them or where they had gone. They had been taken to a boarding school. When one of my grandmother's sisters was caught speaking Cherokee at the boarding school, she was locked in the dark basement where they stored a skeleton used for anatomy lessons overnight. She's still terrified of the dark almost 80 years later. The Red Lake school shootings. In 2005, an internet-addicted asshole kid went into his high school and killed a bunch of 15-year-old kids, a security guard, and a teacher, I believe. It's been years, so even though I was in the middle school at the time, the details are hazy. After killing his grandfather and his grandfather's younger girlfriend, when the police arrived, he killed himself. There were 10 deaths total, only 3 less than Columbine, but Columbine was in 1999. It was horrible, but it's never discussed. Why? I believe that nobody remembers it because it happened on an Indian reservation, and only 1 white life was lost. Edit. For fuck's sake, I'm not race baiting and I'm not racist. Edit 2. This has everything to do with race. White privilege is real. Please quit sending me nasty messages. And I know y'all downvoted the hell out of me, because this is underneath posts with like 50 upvotes. The Aztecs performed acts of massive human sacrifice of slaves. In one such event, over 10,000 slaves had their hearts torn out while still alive. The blood permanently stained the pyramid. By the time that the Spaniard Cortés arrived, thousands of natives from conquered tribes joined him to be rid of the Aztec Empire. Over 90% of the army against the Aztecs was native tribesmen of former slave nations of the Aztec Empire. Ash from the Dachau concentration camp snowed unto the people in Munich. This was during the summer, and no one batted an eye that there's really no reason for ash to be snowing down on them. They later tried to claim they had no idea about what was going on at Dachau. Yeah, you did. They later tried to claim they had no idea about what was going on at Dachau. Yeah, you did. I have to have sympathy with some of these people. If your choice was between ignoring the fact you're walking through human remains flakes or having you and your loved ones potentially contribute to those flakes, what are you going to do? Vikings would use pigments to make their teeth permanently one color by using a hammer and a sharp pick to make indentations for the dye in the enamel. This could be how the Danish king Harald Bluetooth got his name. Just imagine. Shivers. Mexican here. You will never be taught in our history books about the Maclean Ocampo Treaty. Mexico was in the middle of a civil war, and the government of Benito Juárez signed a treaty in which they basically sold in perpetuity the right of passage through Mexico to the US, for both commerce and troops, in exchange for $4 million to finance the fight against the conservative faction in the Reform War. He also gave the US the right to all benefits derived from that passage and trade, the right to military intervention in case of any threat to passage, and banned Mexico from creating similar treaties with any other country. It wasn't ratified by the US government because they were afraid that it would favor Confederate states. This was shortly before the American Civil War. So, Juarez was almost selling our sovereignty to the US, in exchange of financing his side on that civil war. It doesn't appear in our history books because Juarez is treated as our particular version of Jesus Christ and he never did anything wrong. Most people associate the term final solution with the Holocaust, but it was originally used to refer to the extermination of Native Americans. The United States government came extremely close to wiping out one of their most precious resources, the buffalo, which Native Americans used not only for food, but for its skin, bones, and ligaments, which were made into useful goods as well. The numbers went from the millions to the hundreds at one point. Massacres of families at Wounded Knee, Sand Creek, and dozens of other locations were utterly unprovoked and simply cruel. Tribes were forced from their land and had to endure brutal death marches to reservations in unfamiliar territory, often crammed next to enemy tribes.